You have to play with these things. They're safe enough that you don't have to worry about them. They're all on the inhibitory side of things. And clearly in this day and age, a little experimenting in the inhibitory side of things is not a bad thing.
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 167th episode of this podcast dedicated to the ongoing betterment of your brain by any and all means at your disposal. This is about as close as we're going to get to our Valentine's episode on 2017. We're actually publishing a few days before Valentine's, but we'll consider this it. And there's a plant out there called the Passionflower, which sounds fairly Valentine's-y. We're going to be talking about Passionflower and several other herbs naturally occurring, not necessarily phylogenetically related, but related in their effects in that they promote Gaba within the brain. Gaba is one of the brain's primary neurotransmitters, and we're going to be talking with Dr. Beverly Meyer about Gaba and some of these plants, including Passionflower, in the main interview. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, I'm going to dig a little bit into that study that you've probably heard about, which sounds almost magical, but science has apparently found a way to relatively predictably make people fall in love, or at least really turn up the dials in favor of that happening, if the people in question are mutually attracted to one another and kind of open to the idea. The scientific version of a love potion, which is actually just a list of questions in the ruthless listener retention gimmick. But before we get into any of that, let's kick things off, as usual, with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So everybody's got their idiosyncrasies, their little personal pet peeves. And for some people, and maybe you know somebody like this, certain noises really bother them. It might be somebody chewing gum and sort of smacking their lips, or some people really, really hate whistling. And other people seem to be able to pretty much make do with any noises going on around them. But for some folks, the level of annoyance that they get from certain noises really goes beyond just normal annoyance and kind of gets into a pathological realm where it really kicks in their amygdala level. I'm going to commit acts of violence because I dislike that sound so much. Totally irrational behavior, or at least irrational inclinations. And this deep and inexplicable hatred of certain sounds is called misophonia. Kind of like how being a misanthrope means you don't like people, being misophonic means you deeply, deeply dislike certain sounds. For a long time, there's been a debate in the psychological community as to whether misophonia is really a diagnosable condition or whether it's really just people being too easily annoyed. But some new findings published in this month's Current Biology magazine, based on research from a team at Newcastle University, seems to have found a physical basis for misophonics and pretty much come down definitively on the side of, yes, this is a diagnosable condition. You might be able to look at a human brain without knowing anything about the brain's owner now with this new data and say, yes, this person is a misophonic. So what are some of these trigger sounds, as they're called, in misophonics? It varies from person to person, as you might imagine, but some common ones are the sounds of eating, chewing, repeated pen clicking, rustling papers. So common noises, and the kind of thing that in the right context, almost anybody might find somewhat annoying, but doesn't drive most people into a murderous rage. In misophonics, these trigger sounds will cause heightened physiological responses like sweating and an increased heart rate, classic signs of physiological arousal, in addition to identifiable brain changes. MRI studies of misophonics showed abnormal connections between a frontal lobe area called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and another area called the anterior insular cortex, the latter of which is known to be involved in processing emotions and integrating signals both from the body and from the outside world. In most people without misophonic tendencies, trigger sounds cause increased activity in the anterior insular cortex, but decreased activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, whereas in misophonic subjects, both areas show increased activity, says Dr. Tim Griffiths, a professor of cognitive neurology at Newcastle University. I was part of the skeptical community myself until we saw patients in the clinic and understood how strikingly similar the features of their conditions were. We now have evidence to establish the basis for the disorder through the differences in brain control mechanisms in misophonia. This will suggest therapeutic manipulations and encourage a search for similar mechanisms in other conditions associated with abnormal emotional reactions. So who knows, maybe people clicking their pins and chewing too loudly, opening a doorway into a whole new study of emotional overreactions and their neurological basis.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title, twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes. SportFreak315 from the USA says, "Keep putting out the great content. It has already helped me step up my focus and productivity tenfold." And Bosson from Sweden says, "I listen to a lot of podcasts, but usually it's just stuff I've already heard about. In this case, I can say that is not the case. There's always something to learn, and I love the ruthless listener retention gimmicks." Well, thanks to both of you. Also, thanks to listener Daniel DeAngelo, who sent me an email referencing a ruthless listener retention gimmick from back in episode number 164. We talked about hugging and the technologification of society, and wouldn't it be nice if technology could hug us, because that's one thing that humans seem to respond very well to. He sent me a couple of links showing that, yes, this is already happening. On Gizmodo.com, there's apparently a robot phone device that can transmit kisses to your loved ones when you're away. No sooner do we talk about this stuff than it's already out in the world. Just goes to show how fast everything's moving. If you want your brain to be moving fast to keep up with the rapid pace of change, I would be remiss not to recommend our cognitive stack Nexus over at axonlabs.io. You can also click over there from the Smart Drug Smarts homepage if you happen to be on Smart Drug Smarts. Just look for the shop link in the header. We've also got a sister stack to Nexus called Mitogen, aimed specifically at your mitochondria, although that's really not too specific since mitochondria are present in every cell in your body. But yeah, Nexus, Mitogen, try them one, try them both, try them with a loved one on Valentine's Day. And occasionally, every now and then, we'll do a flash sale on Nexus and Mitogen, kind of a temporary crash in prices for about 5 hours, just, something quick going on online. If you want breaking news on that sort of thing when it happens, make sure you're following us on at least a couple of social media sources. We've got Twitter, Facebook, as you would expect, and also a newsletter that you can get over at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. But that's all for the announcements for this week. Let's jump ahead to the main interview.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So it frequently happens when we're putting together the online post that goes along with these podcast episodes and we're looking for an appropriate image. If we're talking about a compound, say a racetam, basically they're all just pictures of a big pile of white powder, which is not terribly photogenic. We do not have this problem this week. The Passionflower is actually an incredibly beautiful plant. It's about as nice as a flower could look, and they're native to the tropical and semi-tropical regions of the U.S., Virginia to Florida, and as far west as Texas, as well as Mexico and Central America, and as far south in the Americas as northern Argentina. They've been used medicinally for a long, long time, since well before the Europeans made it over to the Americas, and the Spanish conquistadors learned from the Aztecs that even back then, passionflower was used as a sedative for nervousness and insomnia. And the same holds true today. Passionflower is used as a component in sedatives in Germany and other parts of Europe, and is often a component of herbal sleep aid formulations here in the US. And passionflower's primary mechanism of action within the brain is based around the neurotransmitter Gaba. And we actually had a Know Your Neurotransmitters episode about Gaba quite a while back. That was episode number 70, almost 100 episodes ago, but might be worth dusting that one off if you're curious. Dr. Beverly Meyer, who I'm about to be speaking with, is both an expert on Gaba and also a big fan. It's actually a neurotransmitter she was once very, very short on, as you will hear in the coming interview. She'll be talking a bit about tinctures, which, in addition to being a tough word to say, is a term not everybody might be familiar with. Just in case you're curious, the old version of the term is any substance that colors, dyes, or stains. But nowadays, when you hear about it in a supplement or medicinal context, it's a solution of a medicinal substance in an alcohol solvent. And Dr. Meyer is very active online. She is also host of the Paleo Health podcast, where she talks about diet, primal living, and being gluten-free, among other things. And we will link over to her blog on the show notes for this episode. So now, with no further ado, Dr. Beverly Meyer.
I had become quite ill several times in my life with unremitting anxiety and just the inability to sleep or calm down. My nervous system was basically just turned on and it would not shut down. And it really was debilitating. Very rapid heart rate that went on for a long time. This really went on for months, that you would consider it a several month-long panic attack. And I finally found a neurologist that seemed to have some ideas of what was actually going on. And after several days and a lot of different testing, he said, well, here's the problem. You have no GABA in your brain at all. So I didn't know about GABA. I, of course, know about serotonin. That's something we've all known about for decades, but I didn't really understand about GABA. So that began my research into that. And he first put me on prescription anti-epileptics, which work with that GABA neurotransmitter receptor. Mm-hmm. And I, of course, was completely terrified about being on some kind of an anti-epileptic.
And you'd never had any sort of epilepsy or seizures?
No, but he said when your GABA gets this low, he said basically you are having seizures. They just don't look like something out of the movies. But it has to do, GABA, with managing rhythm and stability in the brain. And when you don't have it, things are firing at random. So after a short stint on very low dose of some anti-epileptic drugs, that was my deal with him. Okay, I'll try that, but it's going to have to be really low doses. And within a week, I don't remember what I started out on, Depakote out or one of the anti-epileptic type support drugs. And it just was a miraculous thing. I could absolutely tell that my brain was different and that my life could go on. And that's what started my adventure in understanding these GABA receptors and neurotransmitters. And now it seems that in my own clinical practice in San Antonio, the number one thing people come in with, or at least in their top 3, is either anxiety or insomnia or inability to handle stress.
Right. 3 symptoms that oftentimes seem like they come as part of a packaged deal.
They do. So that's how I've become so committed to looking at how GABA is made and how it's used and the dozens of different functions it performs. It's the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. So literally anything can be going crazy up there and in the gut, all the second brain and all the neurons everywhere. If GABA is not present to inhibit something once it has fired and you no longer need it to keep firing.
How is it a person winds up with almost no measurable GABA in one's brain?
Well, bacteria in the gut make GABA, for one thing. Mm-hmm. So whenever you start talking about the microbiome and antibiotics and probiotics and leaky gut and gluten intolerance and intestinal inflammation and anything down that whole road of gut health, you're already looking at the possibility that we're not making adequate GABA. And then there is a complicated interface between GABA and the GAD65 enzymes in the brain that is very much part of a gluten factor, that gluten antibodies can disturb that connection. So right off the bat, you've got gut things in whatever form they started out as, and then you have the possible presence of gluten antibodies that are disturbing the flow and the connectivity of those neurotransmitters. Mm-hmm. And then ultimately, we get back to the fact that call it stress, call it whatever you want, but the survival instinct in all creatures is we are alert to change because any kind of a change could be a danger. A loud crackling noise in the bushes behind us, something on the ground, is that a snake? Is it a stick? So we're alert to noises and sounds and smells that keep us aware of sorting out where that came from and rationalizing and understanding whether it's friend or foe. Mm-hmm. And in modern life, everything now has become so fast, so sensory, buzz, beep, alert, rush, this constant stream of pressure from the outside that it uses up our supply of GABA that is trying to help tell our brain, no, it's okay. It's just my alarm clock. It's not the fire alarm, for example. And no, I'm not late to work and risking my job. Well, okay, maybe I'm 5 minutes late, but life will go on. So we're using our GABA up too quickly by the way that we live. So one of the things that I recommend to people is for anyone that is willing to do that, a good stress evaluation of your life is really important. And that starts with what you're eating and how you're keeping your blood sugar stable. So hunger is one of our most primordial dangers and alerts, right? Mm-hmm. When we're hungry, we are under potential threat and danger. So no living creature likes to be hungry. It is an alarm. So I'm very adamant about people that, especially women, we don't handle our blood sugar as well as muscular people, which generally tends to be healthier, younger men. That's a generalization. But it seems to me that in my experience, women don't handle hunger very well, and it makes us anxious. Hunger equals anxiety. So one of the first things really urge on my clients is we've got to get your blood sugar stable and eating on time without starchy foods and starchy carbs. So that's one place to start.
I must admit, I wouldn't have suspected it would be possible to have flatlined GABA levels in something other than an extreme life-threatening emergency or rare genetic abnormality or something like that, but quite a story.
Because GABA is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter, it's in charge of everything. And its whole focus is turn it on, turn it off. So it doesn't turn on, but allow activation and then disconnect activation. So the word stability, if you have to describe GABA in one word, is stability. And the way, again, that we live and think and the pressures we're under in life, we're not stable. So we can put diarrhea or constipation, high blood pressure or low blood pressure, high blood sugar, low blood sugar, too much, too frequent urination, too frequent perspiration, PMS, tremors, rage, insomnia, muscle tension, anxiety, of course, schizophrenia, bipolar, some epilepsy, some even say autism spectrum disorder is well in there, and pain. Our perceptions of pain are altered when GABA is not adequate. Right. And, kind of the ultimate GABA, of course, are the painkillers and the prescription painkillers or morphine or heroin where we feel no pain. So when we're deficient in GABA, we sense or feel pain much more acutely than we could or should or did. So GABA is very associated with pain as well as muscular tension and tension headaches and muscle issues. So it's an enormously huge neurotransmitter, which we can support with some herbs and then long-term with food, with lifestyle, and with learning to manage our mind so that we are not anxious about so many things every hour of the day and night.
Before a person reaches for supplements or something outside of their diet and lifestyle, what are some of the foods that could be within a person's regular diet to promote GABA, or some foods that can be taken out that might be inhibiting our processing of GABA naturally within our systems?
Well, I'm going to go right straight back to the starchy carbs, grains, gluten. I teach a form of the paleo diet on my website and my DVD on the diet for human beings, that we are not genetically processed to eat and forage and digest grass and grass seed. And yet that is what wheat and corn and rice and oats and all these things are. They're the seeds of grasses. And not only that, of course, they've been highly modified and altered and herbicide and everything else as well. So getting the grains out, the starchy grains, the starchy foods, the sugars, not only does it help, of course, keep that blood sugar stable, number one. Number two, we avoid the gluten antibody that's interfering with the GAD65 enzyme system in the brain. But number three, yes, of course, we do need to be eating the fats and proteins and the vegetables because they are the raw materials for everything we want to put together. That and doing some lifestyle rehab. Humans, most creatures on this planet, we are cyclical and have circadian rhythms and monthly rhythms, and we're very rhythmic creatures.
Right.
So, I'm big on believing that we need to go to bed on time. We need to get up at the same time. We need to eat at the same time. Blue light blockers are really essential at night to shut down the production of cortisol in the night so that melatonin can increase naturally. So I have very few lights on in the house at night. They have yellow light bulbs, or I'm wearing good high quality blue blocker glasses. And that really does make a difference because we can't make melatonin to shut down cortisol and epinephrine without darkness. So when we're cranking out cortisol and adrenaline at night, we're asking our body to try to pump in some GABA to try to calm us down. So those are some basic lifestyle things, and the herbs and things are simple too. But that's where we kind of start with the lifestyle stuff, is getting your head straight, learn to manage your mind, learn what's real and what's irrational thinking.
Once you recognized what the issue was with your own anxiety levels, how long did it take you with the various interventions that you tried to kind of normalize things and get to where you are now?
Well, right off the bat, within a week on low-dose Depakote or whichever one it was, we played with several very low-dose products over time to see where I felt the most comfortable. But then, even though I'd been off gluten for many years and teach gluten-free, at some point I found Cyrex Labs, which has the best gluten test in the world. I highly recommend people take the Cyrex Labs gluten and wheat analog test. If you think you're off of gluten but want to know for sure, that is the only way to find out. And I took that test, of course, expecting snobbily to completely pass it because I'm such an expert on gluten, and I flunked.
Oh, no.
And it was quite shocking. And it took me several months to figure out where it was coming from. And it ended up being a tiny amount of dust that I was breathing from a feed for my horses, my little pony and donkey, that oats was like the 9th ingredient in the feed.
And you were inhaling gluten. It wasn't in your diet at all, per se.
Unbelievable, isn't it? And I now have a much greater appreciation. If you're going to be off of gluten, you need to be off gluten and just handling pet kibble, whatever. And plus it gets under your fingernails or on the cuff of your shirt, whatever. So
that's scary that it's so bioactive, though, that small little amount is still going to make a difference. If somebody asked me that prior to this conversation, I would have said that, well, that little amount, there's no way it would ever actually make a difference.
I totally agree. But I finally did figure out that's exactly what it was. And I, of course, took steps of a mask, and I'd had clothes that I'd only wear in the barn, etc., while I spent months, it was impossible trying to find gluten-safe horse feed that I could actually get at a local feed store without driving more than 3 hours. And then from the day that began, I went 6 months, which is what we're told when you're really tracking gluten exposure, you need to be 100% for 6 months. And when I did the test again, it was completely clear. But that was me, and clearly that's a marker for celiac disease if you have that violent a reaction to that pinpoint amount of gluten. So that was a big factor. And then, of course, the prescription. But then I started working with the herbs, and that's when I discovered passionflower. And what an incredible herb passionflower is. It grows wild on the fences here in Texas. It's a stunning flower. When it's made into tincture or dried into capsules, I like the dosability of being in tinctures. You can take a little or a lot. It actually provides GABA. It's like a straight GABA thing. And it's pretty amazing that we have this herb that theoretically can be used instead of Xanax and Valium and Klonopin, all these other gluten receptor drugs, although obviously it's not as strong, but it can help keep people out of that. And I prefer to sell it in the glycerin form. I have them both on my online store, the glycerin and the alcohol tinctures. But the reason I like the glycerin, even though it has an odd taste, but all herbs can have an odd taste, but you can just take that squirt of passionflower while you're driving down the freeway and you don't need to chase it with water like you do the alcohol tincture. Or keep that bottle right under your pillow so you can take a couple of squirts at night if you rest or you wake up too early. And the sweetness of the glycerin, it makes it more tolerable for younger people too, that they won't take the alcohol tinctures. And the capsules are fine at bedtime, but you may not want a full capsule dose during the day when you're just trying to handle your rush hour thing. You don't want a full capsule of passionflower.
What should people be aware of as far as minimum effective dosages or danger zones where they might go too high? Do people build up a tolerance? What are some of the usage details there?
As far as I know, the answer to all those questions is no worries, mate. The basic 5 calming herbs that I write and talk about are valerian, passionflower, California poppy, skullcap, and chamomile, although chamomile is calming but not necessarily a GABA activator, and kava is, kava. But kava has some weird things with thyroid, so I don't recommend it. But valerian, passionflower, California poppy, skullcap, and chamomile, they're all calming, whether they're providing more of a direct link to GABA or not. Some of them are stronger as sedation than calming, like valerian. Basically, I just recommend people put together a little care package of those 5 tinctures and learn to take them all separately or in combination at any time of the day or the night. And you may find, wow, what really works for me is some passionflower and some California poppy. And if I wake up too early, it seems like just the passionflower helps me go to sleep. It's very individual.
Yeah.
And they're safe enough that you can play with them. So it's calming in the stability sense of the word. And for many of us, as we lie there in bed, and of course, all we can think about is the 12 phone calls we forgot to make and the 12 tomorrow we have to make on arising. GABA is really excellent at just stopping that firing. It just calms that neuronal activity that glutamate is busy up there firing away, and the GABA will suppress that fire. Glutamate is both an amino acid and a neurotransmitter. It's extremely abundant in the body. It's stimulatory, but it won't stop unless GABA turns it off. It's amazing how recently we're starting to understand the power of glutamate as both an abundant amino acid and a super abundant neurotransmitter, and that it's connected to GABA. And I write about GABA as the forgotten neurotransmitter, although it's more like the never known neurotransmitter. We discovered, figured out serotonin and Prozac and all this stuff decades ago. And serotonin, by the way, is equal in almost every way to GABA. It addresses many of the same issues of PMS and muscle tension, pain, anxiety, depression. Serotonin is really key for these too. It just works in a different way than GABA does. But sometimes people are more in need of serotonin support, in which case I use St. John's wort. And then if they're more in need of GABA, we're going for the passionflower or some of the other herbs. But it's that glutamate excitotoxicity that keeps the brain on hyper alert. And when we're hyper alert, we're not rational. We can't make good decisions.
You're on the lookout for the next emergency.
Yes.
We talked recently on another episode about melatonin. As well as it works as a supplement, is something that if you take it at bedtime, it tends to naturally clear itself out of your system before you have time for a full night's sleep. So people that have serious problems maintaining sleep throughout the night, you almost want a delayed release melatonin capsule so it can keep releasing itself into the bloodstream. Is something like Passionflower, does it have any of those same issues where it clears itself maybe more quickly than a person would like if they're going to try to get a full night's sleep?
Yes. Valerian is deeper and longer. And that's why I say it's important to play with the combination of some of those herbs. You may find one of them helps you fall asleep better, and another one helps you when you wake up go back to sleep better. Like I would never take valerian at 4 a.m, for example. But you can take passionflower or skullcap or poppy in the night like that. I lie back down and I do my counting activities in my brain, count backwards from 1,000 by sevens. And that is the best. No, I'm not thinking about that phone call. Absolutely, I'm not thinking about this. All I'm doing is stuck on 922,
Yeah.
It's a great shut-downer of an overactive mind. And obviously, you don't want to take melatonin shortly before morning either because it shuts off in response to light. That's another reason why your bedroom has to be pitch black. We only make melatonin in response to darkness. So it is key that the bedroom is pitch black a couple of hours before you go to bed. Get dark and yellow. Humans evolved. We don't mind yellow and red, but blue means daylight, means wake up, get busy. So anything blue light, we have to handle. Jesse, I want to go back real quick to a GABA issue.
Sure.
And that is the supplement called Gaba, a GABA in a pill, which is widely available. There are different forms. Does it work or not? And then we get to the question of, can GABA cross the blood-brain barrier? So this is a murky area that no one is quite sure, but still the state-of-the-art current general opinion is that GABA in a pill form, like you buy it in the grocery store and it says GABA on the label,
right,
does not cross the blood-brain barrier. There are some studies showing that it can, some studies showing that it can't. The ones that show that it can, I've seen linked then further on down to, you've heard of leaky gut, well, here's leaky brain. That if you react to cheap over-the-counter GABA, it's a potential for what we call leaky brain. And Cyrex Labs has a lab test for that, by the way. So there are forms of GABA in a pill. The one called Pharma GABA, like pharmaceutical. Pharma GABA has been tweaked just enough that it can still be sold over the counter, but theoretically it does cross the blood-brain barrier. It somehow can sneak past. So some people experiment with different forms of pill GABAs, and that's fine. You can do all that as well.
One of the things we haven't talked about in this one is L-theanine, but that's a GABA promoter as well, right? Compound that's naturally found in green tea and I think some other things.
Yes, that's a good point. Theanine works really well for some people and it doesn't work well for other people, but it is worth a try. It definitely does better away from food. So it's not one you just want to pop at dinner and expect it to work because it's an amino acid. Anything that's an amino acid basically needs to be away from food. Otherwise, your body just thinks it's part of your lamb chop. It's just another part of the protein chain. So if you want an amino acid therapeutically, it really should be away from food. So I have quite a few clients. I have them keep theanine right by the bedside table with their big glass of arising room temperature water.
Yeah.
I say the instant your feet hit the floor, you swallow that theanine because so many of us are on full tilt alert, panic, first thing in the morning. Oh gosh, I got to feed the kids and I forgot to iron my shirt and not to mention waking up to an alarm clock. So we're already completely scattered. So theanine can work. It's gentle, it's subtle. It is not a sedative. It is much more obscure in its action, which is absolutely fine. If it just kind of helps you get through the day without snapping at your coworkers or yourself, then that's fine. And some people have that contradictory reaction that it will tend to wake them up if they take it at bedtime. So others, it doesn't help at all, or others, it really does help. So you have to play with these things. They're safe enough that you don't have to worry about them. They're all on the inhibitory side of things. And, clearly in this day and age, we're all too much in the excitatory side of things. So a little experiment in the inhibitory side of things is not a bad thing.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very, very much to Dr. Beverly Meyer for taking the time for that conversation. Lots of really interesting stuff in there. I could not believe that she was actually inhaling a biologically significant amount of gluten in the feed from her horses by being in a horse barn. A, that's really interesting, and B, it makes you extremely conscious of everything that you're inhaling when you're in a horse barn. Probably involves a biologically significant amount of horse poop too, and other things you might rather not think about. I'm glad that she underscored the point in there that it seems pretty likely that GABA is a straight supplement, does not cross the blood-brain barrier, and is probably useless in itself. One of these sideways approaches to promoting GABA within our brain. Things like Passionflower are going to be a more effective approach. I thought it was fun hearing her be a little cavalier with encouraging people to play around with things like Passionflower, some of these more relaxing chemical agents, things that aren't going to amp you up and overstimulate you. And I think she's probably right that the downside, taking too much of something like Passionflower, is probably getting a really deep night's sleep, maybe longer than you intended to, but not quite the same type of worst case scenarios as you might find with a stimulant. I'm not entirely sure that I agree with the premise that we're using up too much GABA based on the hecticness of our modern lives these days. That's one of the things that I think people say, and everybody sort of nods their heads and like, yeah, my life is really hectic. But I kind of bet that's always been true, or at least that life has always been stressful, if not hectic. I think if you were living 200 or 300 years ago and you were worried that your family might not make it through the winter with everybody alive, that's got to be pretty stressful, despite the fact that you didn't have a cell phone beeping at you. Probably something that could be endlessly debated, and this isn't the place to do it. But now let's switch gears from calming chemicals to things that can stoke the romantic fires in the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So way back in 2015, in the New York Times Modern Love column around Valentine's Day, there was an article about two people that fell in love, one of whom was the author of the article. And they did so in a kind of unusual way that seemed like it was almost by design, as opposed to the more happenstance method that is kind of par for the course, almost like climbing into love versus falling into love. They used 36 questions, which were originally from a psychological study developed by Dr. Arthur Aaron in 1997 for a study on interpersonal closeness. So interpersonal closeness and romantic love, you can see where the Venn diagrams overlap there. Although the original study didn't necessarily have anything to do with romance, but instead was just looking at the mechanisms of creating affection between people in an experimental setting. There are actually plenty of things that psychological researchers would like to be able to look at that require some level of affinity between the subjects, and when you're randomly selecting subjects or trying to get volunteers for a study, oftentimes those people might need to fall into some other demographic. They might need to have blood type X or be experts in the ukulele, whatever it is, and finding people that fit that model and that are available for the study and that also have personal affinity towards one another might be well nigh impossible. And so being able to reliably create interpersonal affinity between people who start out as strangers, that's a pretty handy thing for those psychological researchers. You can also think of a million other times when it would be nice, basically to help people be able to make friends quickly. And so Dr. Aaron, in this study called The Experimental Generation of Interpersonal Closeness, created 36 questions. They were broken into 3 groups of 12, each of which were sort of increasingly personal in the information that you would divulge to the person you're speaking with. The idea is that the research subjects, who were strangers to one another to begin with, would be broken off in groups of 2, sort of be sitting at a desk decently far away from the other participants in the experiment. So they were in public, but having a one-on-one conversation, kind of maybe akin to what it might be like to be in a restaurant talking with one other person, but there's other folks around. And then they would alternate, one person asking one question, and then each person would answer it. So I would ask a question, answer the question, then you would answer the question, then you would ask the next question, answer the question, then I would answer it. So everybody answers all questions, and the questions themselves are gradually escalating in intimacy. The control groups in this experiment were doing the same amounts of talking, spending the same amount of time in one-on-one conversation with a stranger, but the questions were much more what somebody would consider small talk, not divulging too much personal information about oneself. In this case, there was almost no question as to the statistical significance in the difference between the feelings of intimacy and closeness that the experimental subjects felt to one another after doing the escalatingly personal questions versus the small talk conversations. And the levels of affinity that people felt for one another, it wasn't affected much by other factors. They tried it different ways. They had men talking with men, men talking with women, women talking with women, and the sex of the people involved didn't really have much of an effect on how close the people felt. Again, this isn't necessarily romantic closeness, it's just, do I like this person afterwards? They also did some manipulations where they told the people, hey, the person that you're being matched with is somebody that we think you'll like and we think they'll like you. In other cases, they didn't give any forewarning as to whether they expected the person to like them or not. That expectation of affinity didn't seem to have any effect. And even when they tried to get some personality backgrounds on the people, matching them up in pairs where they felt like there would be a natural underlying affinity, even that statistically sort of washed out compared to the strength of the questions themselves. So although the research originally didn't have anything to do with helping people fall in love with one another, since this New York Times story a couple of years ago, this has been one of these stories that's been trotted out each Valentine's Day and has been one of the rare psychological studies that actually kind of makes it into the general public dialogue. A lot of people have heard about this now, and most people have heard about this in the context of romantic love. So on the one hand, given that it's Valentine's, I sort of wanted to talk about this study almost as a bit of a Mythbusters, that these questions are not a love potion per se. But on the other hand, it really is interesting how this is a scientifically validated 45-minute behavioral prescription for people liking one another more. Probably one of these ideas that really should be popularized. I think a lot of people have heard about this, but don't necessarily know that the 36 questions themselves are not under lock and key somewhere, but widely publicly available. We'll have the link to the original study on the webpage. All 36 questions are in the appendix at the end, and they start with innocuous things like, before you are making a telephone call, do you ever rehearse what you're going to say? And they end with things like, if you were to die this evening with no opportunity to communicate with anyone, what would you most regret not having told someone, and why haven't you told them yet?
We like to think of ourselves as a digital speakeasy for brain hackers, but you can call us Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, you heard it. That is the entire episode at number 167 coming in for a landing. Thank you for hanging around until the very end. If you enjoyed this episode, everything that we talked about here will be linked up at smartdrugsmarts.com/167. And if you missed last week's episode, in number 166, we talked with Dr. Chris Masterjohn about omega-6 fatty acids, arachidonic acid, and some of its biological precursors. Next week is just a little bit up in the air. We're going to be talking either about biometric tracking or potentially the usefulness of using small amounts of marijuana against Alzheimer's and senile dementia. Both of those interviews will be coming down the pike soon. I'm just not quite sure which one's going to hit first. In any event, a happy Valentine's Day to everybody, and I will see you back here next week on Friday as usual, same time, same podcast, and with that same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.